Olivia Hayes stood at the living room window, watching the autumn sun slowly slipping toward the horizon. Tonight's dinner was going to be special, the first time the whole family would be together in a long time. Her hands automatically adjusted the already perfectly arranged cutlery, while her thoughts wandered somewhere far away. "Tom, have you seen my sapphire earrings?" she shouted without turning around. "The ones you gave me for our 15th anniversary." There was no reply lately. Thomas often didn't hear her questions, immersed in his own thoughts or, he claimed, in important work projects. 20 years of marriage had turned their relationship into a comfortable routine, but in recent months, Olivia had sensed a growing chasm between them. She went upstairs to the bedroom. Thomas stood in front of the mirror, carefully tying his tie. His tall figure, barely touched with gray at the temples, still looked imposing in his navy blue suit. "You're especially dressed up today," Olivia said, opening the jewelry box. "It's a family reunion," he replied absently, staring at his reflection. "What time are Grace and Abby arriving?" "About 7. Grace had already texted that they'd booked a cab from the airport. Olivia looked at her husband carefully. She couldn't help but notice the change in his tone at the mention of Abby. Something elusive flashed in his eyes. Impatience. Excitement? Strange, since they'd seen her niece only a few months ago at her 18th birthday party. The kitchen was filled with the aromas of roasting meat and spices. Catherine, their housekeeper, was working on the stove, preparing the family's favorite dishes. "Everything is perfect, Catherine." Olivia nodded approvingly. "You can finish up and go home. I can take it from here." "Are you sure, Mrs. Hayes? I could stay and help set up." "It's family night. I think we can manage without strangers." When Catherine left, Olivia opened a bottle of expensive red wine to let it breathe before serving. Her gaze fell on the picture on the mantelpiece. Grace, her older sister, hugging her daughter Abby at the prom. How quickly her niece had grown up. It seemed like only yesterday she was running around this house with dolls, and today she was already a freshman at the University of Chicago, a smart and strikingly beautiful girl. The doorbell interrupted her musings. Olivia hurried to open it, smiling broadly. "Grace, I missed you so much." The sisters embraced. Despite their similarities, the same brown hair and green eyes, their personalities were strikingly different. If Olivia was always the embodiment of focus and purpose, Grace was characterized by softness and spontaneity. "Olivia, you're as beautiful as ever," Grace said with genuine admiration. "Your house shines like a museum." Abby appeared behind Grace. Olivia froze for a moment. When had her niece changed so much? She was not just a grown-up girl, but a real beauty, with fine features, long blonde hair, and a strikingly mature look in her brown eyes. "Aunt Olivia," Abby kissed her politely on the cheek. The girl smelled of expensive perfume, not on a student's budget. "Abby, darling, how are your studies going? Thomas has told me so much about your progress," Olivia stammered. How could Thomas know about Abby's studies? As far as she knew, they'd barely spoken to each other. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Thomas was coming down. Olivia couldn't help but notice how Abby froze for a moment when she saw him. Their gazes met, and something flashed between them. Some silent message, some hidden connection that Olivia didn't know about. "Grace, it's so good to see you." Thomas hugged his sister-in-law, then turned to Abby. "And you, young lady, seem determined to outshine everyone today." There was a strange intimacy in his voice. Olivia glanced at her sister, but she didn't seem to notice, busy talking to the neighbor who had appeared in the hall and whom Thomas had invited to join them for dinner. At the table, the conversation flowed casually. Grace talked about her work at the charity. Thomas shared the latest business news. Abby talked about the university, but Olivia noticed that she kept glancing at Thomas, and he casually touched her hand, passing her salt or bread. After dessert, Olivia went upstairs to get an album of family photos. As she passed her husband's study, she noticed the door was ajar and the light was on inside. Thomas always locked the study when he left. It had been his rule throughout their years of marriage. Driven by a sudden impulse, Olivia stepped inside. Thomas's cell phone was on the desk, the one he never left unattended. The screen was glowing, a new message had come in. Olivia knew she shouldn't look, but something nudged her hand. The message was from Abby. "I've missed you every day. I can't wait for us to be together again." Olivia felt the ground go from under her feet. With trembling fingers, she flipped through her correspondence history. Dozens, hundreds of messages. Pictures her aunt should never have seen. Words of love, meetings in hotels, plans for the future. It took her a few minutes to pull herself together and return to her guests. No one noticed her absence. Grace was chatting passionately with a neighbor, and Thomas and Abby were sitting side by side, their shoulders almost touching, their heads bowed in silent discussion. Olivia sat down at the table, clutching her husband's cell phone tightly in her hand. "Thomas, darling." Her voice sounded unnaturally calm. "You left your phone in the study. There were a lot of interesting messages." Thomas turned pale when he saw the phone in her hands. "Olivia, I can explain." "Explain what?" Grace looked from her sister to her brother-in-law with a perplexed expression. "The fact that your son-in-law and your daughter have been having an affair behind our backs for the past 6 months." Olivia placed the phone on the table, screen up. "According to these messages, it started before Abby's 18th birthday." There was a deafening silence. Abby went white as a sheet. Thomas froze with a petrified face. Grace reached for the phone with a trembling hand, ran her eyes over the screen, and let out a squeezed sound like a sob. "How could you, Thomas?" she whispered. "She's a child. She's my daughter." "I'm 18. I'm not a child." Abby jumped up. "And I love him." "Do you?" Olivia laughed, a bitter, broken laugh. "You have no idea what love is. He's twice your age. He's your aunt's husband. How long were you planning on fooling us?" "Olivia, it's not what you think. Abby and I. It's just a fling, a mistake." "A mistake?" Abby was now looking at him with pain and disbelief. "You said you loved me. That we'd be together." "God." Grace covered her face with her hands. "This is a nightmare. My sister, my daughter, my—" "Grace, let me explain," Thomas began. But Olivia interrupted him sharply. "There's nothing to explain. It's very clear. You both betrayed our family." "You don't understand." Abby looked at her aunt defiantly. "We didn't mean to hurt anyone. It just happened. We tried to fight the feelings, but how old were you when he started his courtship? 17? 16? Olivia's voice shook with rage. "Thomas, do you realize that this is a crime?" "It's not like that," Thomas exclaimed. "I've never—" "You're disgusting!" Grace hissed, rising from the table. "Both of you!" The thunderstorm outside the window came with renewed vigor, lighting up the dining room with bright flashes of lightning. A deafening clap of thunder made everyone shudder. "It's too late to go out in this weather," Olivia said grimly. "Besides, we have a lot to talk about. Everyone's staying the night." "I'm not staying under the same roof as them," Grace glared hatefully at Thomas and her daughter. "Look, it's just not safe to go out right now." Olivia took her sister's hand. "You'll sleep in the guest bedroom, and in the morning, we'll figure out what to do next." Abby stood with her arms wrapped around herself, as if protecting herself from the world. "I'm staying too," she said quietly but firmly. "I have something to say, and I want everyone to listen." "You'd better be quiet," Grace cut her off. "I can't even look at you right now." "Grace," Olivia squeezed her sister's shoulder. "Come on, I'll show you to your room. And you?" She looked coldly at Thomas and Abby. "You can stay here and continue your conversation." Olivia led her sister upstairs, leaving Thomas and Abby alone in the dining room. The tension seemed like it could be touched with their hands. This night promised to be a very long one for all the occupants of the Hayes house. Sunlight was streaming through the heavy curtains when Olivia opened her eyes. The clock on the bedside table read 7 in the morning. She hadn't slept much, having tossed and turned all night, replaying last night's events over and over in her head. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas's face, twisted with fear and shame, and Abby's face, defiant and confused at the same time. Olivia got out of bed. Thomas never came to their bedroom, having apparently spent the night in the guest room on the first floor. She showered, put on a strict navy blue suit as if she were going to court, and went down to the kitchen. The house greeted her with an oppressive silence. Even the walls seemed to have absorbed last night's scandal. She put the coffee pot on the stove and went to the window. The morning was clear, as if the night storm had never happened. just wet grass and fallen leaves to remind her of it. Olivia took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. She was going to have a difficult conversation with her husband today. Divorce? An attempt to save the marriage? She hadn't decided yet. The coffee was starting to boil when Olivia heard footsteps on the stairs. Grace, pale and gaunt, entered the kitchen. "You didn't sleep," Olivia said, pouring her sister a cup of coffee. "How can you sleep?" Grace sank down in her chair. "I've been thinking all night. How could we not see it? How could I not see? They tried so hard to hide it." Olivia sat down across from her. "I didn't suspect anything myself until last night." "What's going to happen now?" Grace looked at her sister with pain and confusion. "I don't know, but I'm not going to make a scandal and divide the property through the courts. We're just going to split up quietly. But with Abby, you're going to have a serious talk with your daughter." Grace nodded, clutching her cup with trembling hands. "I'm going to talk to Thomas," Olivia continued. "I think he's in the study. Yesterday when we left, he said he'd be working late. Do you want me to come with you?" "No," Olivia shook her head. "This is supposed to be a conversation between husband and wife, one last conversation." She headed toward Thomas's office. The door was closed, but not locked. Olivia knocked. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder. "Thomas, we need to talk." Silence. Olivia grabbed the handle and pushed the door open. The office was in semi-darkness. The thick curtains kept out the morning light. She flicked on the light switch. Thomas sat in his leather chair, leaning back, facing the door. His eyes were open, but his gaze was frozen, not focusing on anything. There was a dark stain on his white shirt, with the hilt of a knife sticking out of the center of it, the same antique paper knife Olivia had given her husband for their 15th anniversary. A scream caught in her throat. Olivia jerked back, hitting her back against the door jamb. The world around her spun, and she felt her knees buckle. "Olivia? What's wrong?" Grace's voice sounded distant. Olivia couldn't answer. She just pointed with a trembling hand toward the chair. Grace peeked into the office, and her scream echoed throughout the house. The next 2 hours merged into one endless nightmare for Olivia. The call to the police, uniforms arriving. Then CSIs and EMTs scurrying around the house, turning it into a crime scene. And finally, Detective Mark Lewinsky, a tall man with shrewd gray eyes and premature gray on his temples. "Mrs. Hayes," he shook Olivia's hand. "I'm sorry for your loss. I realize this is a difficult moment, but I need to ask you some questions." They settled in the living room. Olivia, Grace, and Abby, who had woken up from the noise, sat apart from everyone else, huddled in the corner of the couch. Her eyes were red with tears, but her face remained strangely impassive. "Tell me what happened last night," Lewinsky asked, pulling out a notebook. Olivia took a deep breath and started talking. About the family dinner, about the messages they'd found, about the revelation of the affair between Thomas and Abby, about the scandal and the decision to spend the night in the house because of the storm. "And who was the last person to see Mr. Hayes alive?" the detective asked, watching each of the women's reactions carefully. "I did," Olivia said quietly. "About 11 o'clock at night. Thomas said he'd be working in the study. I went up to the bedroom and never saw him again." "What about you, Miss Donovan?" Lewinsky turned to Abby. "I went to my room right after it all came out," the girl said in a hushed voice. "I didn't come out until this morning." "Mrs. Donovan? I went up to my room too." Grace looked exhausted. "Olivia walked me up to my room, and then she went to her room." Lewinsky made a note in his notebook. "So all three were in the house at the time of Mr. Hayes' death." He looked up. "Did you hear anything suspicious during the night? Footsteps, voices, unusual noises?" All three of them shook their heads in the negative. "Mrs. Hayes, did your husband have any enemies? Someone who might have wanted him dead?" "Thomas had a lot of competitors in the business," Olivia said slowly. "But I can't imagine any of them." She didn't finish the sentence. "The murder weapon belonged to your house?" "Yes," Olivia swallowed hard. "It's a letter opener I gave Thomas a few years ago. It was always on his desk." "According to the preliminary examination, the death occurred between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning," the detective said. "All of you were in the house at the time. Were the doors locked?" "Yes, I checked them myself." Olivia nodded. Thomas had always been very particular about security. And the alarm system? On, as usual. Lewinsky tapped his pen thoughtfully on his notebook. So, we're ruling out a home invasion. Someone in the room had access to the office at night. There was a heavy silence in the room. Are you suspecting one of us? Grace was indignant. This is absurd. At the moment, Mrs. Donovan, I'm only gathering information, replied Lewinsky calmly. Let me talk to each of you separately. He started with Olivia. They moved to the dining room, where the detective asked her to elaborate on her relationship with her husband. 20 years of marriage. Olivia stared out the window, unable to see anything in front of her. The last few years, we'd drifted apart. I suspected he was having affairs, but I turned a blind eye. For the sake of our family, for our position in society. But yesterday, it was out of line. Were you very angry when you found out about your husband's affair with your niece? Of course. Olivia looked him straight in the eye. But not angry enough to kill him, if that's what you're implying. Do you have an alibi for the time of the murder? I was asleep in my bedroom. Alone. Olivia crossed her arms over her chest. I have insomnia. I take sleeping pills. I took one last night around midnight and slept through the night. Can I see those sleeping pills? Olivia pulled a bottle of pills out of her purse. How long have you been taking them? About a year. Doctor's prescription? Lewinsky made a note. Were you and your husband having financial disagreements? No. Olivia shook her head. We share a business and accounts. In the event of a divorce, we'd split everything equally. I see. The detective closed his notebook. Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. Could you ask Miss Donovan to join me? Abby entered the room with her head down. She sat down across from the detective, nervously tugging at the sleeve of her sweater. Miss Donovan, tell me about your relationship with Mr. Hayes. We loved each other. Abby looked up with tears in her eyes. It wasn't a dirty affair like they all think. It was a real feeling. How long ago did your relationship begin? 6 months ago, on my 18th birthday. Tom was so attentive, so caring. No one had ever treated me like that. Did your aunt and mother know about this? No, of course not. Abby grinned bitterly. They wouldn't have understood. Just like they didn't understand yesterday. What did you do after everyone had gone to their rooms? I already told you. I was in my room, crying. Abby looked away. I didn't kill him, if that's what you mean. Are you sure you didn't leave your room at night? Lewinsky leaned closer. Maybe you wanted to talk to Mr. Hayes alone? I didn't leave my room. Abby raised her voice. Why would I kill the one man who truly loved me? Are you sure he loved you? After last night's scandal? Maybe he said something that made you question it? Abby bit her lip. He didn't defend me to them, if that's what you mean. But I understood him. He needed time. Time for what, Miss Donovan? To think things through, to decide how to move forward, she sighed. We planned to be together, for real. Lewinsky studied her face, trying to see if she was telling the truth. Do you still have the messages from Mr. Hayes? Yes, but, they're private. I'll need to go through them. Abby nodded reluctantly. You can invite your mother in. Grace entered the room with tear-stained eyes, but she was much more collected than her daughter. Mrs. Donovan, how did you react when you heard about your son-in-law's affair with your daughter? Like any normal mother would. Her voice was hard. I was shocked and outraged. Thomas was using Abby. She's a naive girl, and he's a grown, experienced man. It's disgusting. So disgusting that you might want to kill him? Grace looked at the detective with unconcealed rage. I didn't kill him, though I will not deny the thought crossed my mind. But there's a big difference between thought and action. Where were you between midnight and 2 a.m.? In my room. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I took a shower, then I read a book I found on the shelf. What book? Grace was confused for a moment. Some kind of detective story. I don't remember the title. I didn't really read it. Did you have access to Mr. Hayes' office? No. Grace shook her head. I don't know this house very well. I don't come here very often. When was the last time you spoke to your son-in-law? At dinner, when everything was revealed. I didn't see him after that. Lewinsky closed his notebook and thanked Grace. Then he returned to the living room where all three women were waiting for him. Ladies, I must inform you that at this time you all remain under suspicion, he announced. None of you leave the city without my knowledge. My colleagues will continue to examine the crime scene, and I will return with more questions after I receive the results of the forensics. Over the next few hours, the forensic team methodically explored every corner of the house. They fingerprinted all 3 women, collected DNA samples, recovered the murder weapon, and all possible evidence from the study. After they left, Olivia, Grace, and Abby found themselves alone again in the living room, looking at each other with disbelief and fear. "He thinks one of us did it," Grace whispered. "Do you think otherwise?" Olivia asked coldly. The doors were locked, the alarm was on. No one could get in or out. "Maybe it was a suicide?" Abby suggested uncertainly. "With a knife in his chest? And no suicide note?" Olivia shook her head. "Thomas would never do that." "You don't know what was going through his head," Grace countered. "After everything was revealed—" "No," Olivia cut her off. "I knew him for 20 years. He wouldn't have chosen in such an inelegant way." The doorbell rang. Detective Lewinsky stood on the doorstep. "I'm sorry to bother you ladies, but I have some new questions." He entered the living room and turned to Olivia. "Mrs. Hayes, you mentioned you were taking sleeping pills." "Yes." She looked at him blankly. "According to the medical examiner's preliminary report, the same substance was found in your husband's blood, in a rather large dose." "What?" Olivia blinked in confusion. "But Thomas never took sleeping pills. He considered it a sign of weakness." "Nevertheless, it's there." Lewinsky stared at her. "Are you sure you didn't offer him a pill last night?" "Positive." "May I see your bottle again?" Olivia handed him the vial. Lewinsky scrutinized the label. "When was the last time you took these pills?" "Yesterday before I went to bed. I remember exactly 5 left." Lewinsky opened the vial and dropped the pills into the palm of his hand. There were 4. "Someone took 1 pill," he said slowly. "And according to the forensics, put it in Mr. Hayes's drink, probably to sedate him before killing him." Olivia, Grace, and Abby froze, staring at the 4 white pills in the detective's palm. "One more thing," Lewinsky added. "We checked Mr. Hayes's cell phone. The last message was sent at 12:15 at night, after you said everyone had gone to their rooms." "To whom?" all 3 women asked at the same time. "His lawyer," Lewinsky replied. "James, I need to make an emergency change to the will. Meet me tomorrow at 9 o'clock. It can't wait." Olivia turned pale. "So he was killed after he sent that message," the detective concluded. "And someone really didn't want that will changed." Detective Mark Lewinsky sat in his office, surrounded by crime scene photos. It had been 3 days since the murder of Thomas Hayes, and the investigation was moving slower than he would have liked. On the desk were 3 folders with the prime suspects: Olivia Hayes, Grace Donovan, and Abby Donovan. 3 women, 3 motives, and each with an opportunity to commit a crime. There was a knock on the door, and his assistant entered the office with a folder in hand. Finally, the results of a full toxicology and a report on the Hayes family's finances. While the detective studied the new materials, Olivia Hayes sat in her home office, immersed in her own investigation. Thomas's laptop lay in front of her. The police had copied all the information from it, but had returned the device as not directly relevant to the case. They didn't know what Olivia knew: the existence of a hidden folder protected by a complex password. For the 3rd day, she tried to find the password. In desperation, Olivia typed "traitor," and the screen flashed, revealing the hidden files. Inside were financial documents Olivia hadn't even known existed, secret offshore accounts, transfers of large sums of money, and a series of emails from a man who signed his name simply with the letter G. "Thomas, you can't keep doing this? It's too risky? I expect the promised amount by the end of the month. Otherwise, your dear wife will know everything." The last letter was dated the day of the family dinner. "Either the money tomorrow or I tell everything. Your choice." Olivia was interrupted by a phone call. Detective Lewinsky asked permission to come over. "We have some new information," he began, sitting in the living room. "According to the toxicology report, your husband was drugged with sleeping pills. But in addition to that, he had traces of alcohol and cocaine." "Cocaine?" Olivia couldn't hide her amazement. "That's impossible. Thomas had never used drugs. We also looked into Mr. Hayes' finances. In the last 6 months, he had transferred over $500,000 to various offshore accounts. Olivia told the detective about the files she had found and letters from the mysterious G. Lewinsky methodically went through the documents. Your husband was moving money out of the company, probably making illegal trades, and someone was blackmailing him, he concluded. I need to talk to everyone. Do you mind if I invite your sister and niece? An hour later, all 4 were gathered in the living room. Lewinsky began, Miss Donovan, we checked your cell phone. The night of the murder, at 12:30, you sent a text message to Mr. Hayes. We need to talk. I'm waiting for you in my office. Why did you cover it up? I forgot about that message. Abby paled. I was in such a state. Did you see him that night? Yes, but not for long. We talked and I left. He was alive when I left, I swear. What did you talk about? Tom said it was over, that our affair was a mistake. He was going to send me to study in Europe, away from everyone. And how did you react? I cried, begged him not to do it. But he was adamant. Abby wiped away her tears. I left around 1 o'clock in the morning. He was drinking whiskey, but he was alive. Lewinsky shifted his gaze to Grace. Mrs. Donovan, we checked the calls from your phone. At 1:15 that night, you called Mr. Hayes. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Grace flinched and cast a quick glance at Olivia. Yes, I called him. After Abby went back to her room, I wanted to find out what his intentions were. What did he say to you? That it was over? That he was sending Abby to Europe? Grace clenched her fists. He was slurring his words. He sounded drunk. Did you mention the money he owed you? The $200,000 that Mr. Hayes had deposited into your account in the last 6 months? And another $300,000 that you demanded as compensation. Grace? Olivia stared at her sister in amazement. You blackmailed Thomas? It's not blackmail, it's reparations, Grace snapped. 5 years ago, Thomas convinced me to invest my life savings in his startup, promised me a fortune. But he blew it, the project failed. I was left penniless with a baby in my arms. Why didn't you ever tell me about this? Thomas made me promise to keep quiet. He said he'd pay me back gradually, but he was so slow, and when I found out he'd seduced my daughter, I demanded the whole amount at once, with interest. You are the G, Lewinsky nodded, the blackmailer who threatened to reveal his secrets. I just wanted what was mine. And yes, I was angry, especially when I found out about Abby. But I didn't kill him. Mrs. Hayes, Lewinsky turned to Olivia. You haven't been honest with us either. We found a draft will on your husband's computer. According to it, he wasn't going to leave most of his estate to you, but to Miss Donovan. I didn't know anything about that, Olivia whispered. Let's reconstruct the chronology of events, the detective suggested. At about 11 o'clock at night, everyone went to their rooms. At 12:30, Miss Donovan met with Mr. Hayes. At 1:15, Mrs. Donovan called him. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, according to the CCTV cameras at the front door, someone left the house and returned 10 minutes later. Cameras? Olivia was surprised. But we don't have outdoor cameras. Your neighbor across the street does. Unfortunately, the quality doesn't allow us to accurately identify the person. And you think it was the killer? Abby asked. I want to conduct a little experiment, answered Lewinsky. The detective took out of his pocket 3 sachets of white powder, luminol, a substance that glows on contact with blood. He checked the rooms of all 3 women but found nothing. Detective, Olivia said suddenly, did you check the guest room on the first floor? The one where Thomas was supposed to sleep after our fight? They went downstairs and entered the small guest bedroom. In the drawer of the bedside table, Olivia found an empty bag of white powder residue, and in the bathroom, the luminol revealed faint traces of blood on the floor. So, the detective turned to the women. Someone used this room the night of the murder? Someone who did cocaine and dealt in blood? I think it's time for a final reconstruction of the events, Lewinsky said as everyone returned to the living room. Thomas Hayes was a complicated man with a lot of secrets. He cheated on his wife, had an inappropriate relationship with his niece, cheated in business, and used drugs. That night, his world began to fall apart. Why would anyone want to give Thomas sleeping pills when he was already virtually unconscious from alcohol and drugs? Lewinsky questioned. It was unnecessary. unless the killer wanted to ensure that the victim would be completely helpless. He looked at Olivia. "The sleeping pills are missing from your bottle, Mrs. Hayes, but you had no reason to put your husband to sleep. Abby didn't have access to your medication, but your sister—" "What?" Grace was outraged. "Are you accusing me? You've been in this house before. You knew about Olivia's sleeping problems. You were motivated by money and a desire to protect your daughter." "I didn't kill him." Grace jumped to her feet. "Detective?" Olivia intervened. "I can clarify something. Grace had a cocaine problem a few years ago. She went to rehab and got clean. Did you know?" Grace stared at her sister in shock. "Thomas told me. He said you were in trouble for drugs and he saved you by paying off your debts." "That's a lie," Grace exclaimed. "He never gave me money for treatment. On the contrary, he was the one who first offered me cocaine when I was depressed after my divorce. And then he used my addiction to convince me to invest my life savings in his project." "Oh my God," Olivia whispered. "I didn't know anything." Abby suddenly spoke up. "It was me. I gave him the sleeping pills. I put it in his whiskey while we were talking. I took a pill from Aunt Olivia's room this afternoon, not to kill him. I just wanted him to sleep soundly so I could take his phone and delete our messages. But I didn't kill him." "Then who did?" Lewinsky looked at her insistently. "I don't know. When I left, he was falling asleep in the chair. I talked to him on the phone," Grace objected. "I didn't go to the office, and I certainly didn't stick a knife in him." "Then that leaves only—" Lewinsky turned to Olivia. "I didn't kill Thomas," she said calmly. "But I think I know who did." She went to the window. "You mentioned the cell across the hall, Detective. About the man who left the house at 2 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't one of us. It was a neighbor, James Foster." "A neighbor? Why would you say that?" "Because I found not only letters from the blackmailer on Thomas's computer, but also photos. Thomas wasn't just dating Abby. He was having an affair with James's wife, Karen. And James, as you may recall, had dinner with us that night. And you think he found out about it and decided to get revenge? Not then. He'd known for a long time. In fact, he used it to blackmail Thomas. James was the financial partner in the project where Thomas invested Grace's money. It was James who helped him cash out the money offshore. And it was James, I'm sure, who talked Thomas into making a new will in Abby's favor. But why would he kill Thomas? Because after our family scandal, all secrets were in danger of being exposed. Thomas was desperate, scared, drugged. He could have broken down and told everything. Plus, James had the perfect opportunity. 3 women, each with a motive to kill Thomas, under the same roof on the night of the scandal. "Check the outside cameras again," Olivia suggested. "See if James came to our house before that silhouette left the building. Check the shoe tracks in the study. They should be larger than our women's sizes. And most importantly, check the knife. Thomas cut his finger a couple weeks ago with this knife. If James's prints are found under Thomas's blood..." A week later, Olivia, Grace, and Abby met back at the Hayes house. Detective Lewinsky was with them. "You were right, Mrs. Hayes. The knife did have James Foster's prints underneath your husband's blood. Cameras recorded him entering your house just before midnight, and he did leave the house at 2 a.m. and then return." "Did he confess?" Grace asked. "After the evidence was presented, yes, told the whole story. He and Thomas were doing some shady business together. Foster knew about his wife's affair with Thomas and used it as leverage. When the scandal broke and Thomas was threatened with divorce, he panicked and called James. And James decided that Thomas had become too unreliable a partner," Olivia finished. "Exactly. He'd come to supposedly support his friend, and when he'd almost lost consciousness after being drugged by sleeping pills, alcohol, and cocaine, he'd used a knife. He then left the house briefly to throw away the bloody clothes and return through the back door, using a key Thomas had given him long ago," Lewinsky explained. "He was sure suspicion would fall on one of you. The plan almost worked." "Thomas used all of us," Grace said quietly. "And in the end, he was the victim," Olivia added, looking out the window at the rainy fall day. 6 months later, Olivia Hayes stood at the window of her new home in Lakeview, small but cozy, overlooking Lake Michigan. After everything that had happened, she couldn't stay in the old mansion. Too many painful memories soaked its walls. James Foster's trial ended with a maximum sentence for first-degree murder. The financial machinations he'd been running with Thomas were also the subject of a separate investigation that uncovered a massive fraud scheme. The doorbell rang, interrupting Olivia's musings. Grace and Abby stood on the doorstep with small suitcases and cautious smiles. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Olivia asked, ushering them into the living room. "2 days a week would be perfect for therapy together," Grace replied, hugging her sister. "Besides, Abby wanted to be with you so badly." In the aftermath of the tragedy, all 3 women were bound together not only by blood, but also by shared trauma. Under the guidance of a family psychologist, they began the long road to healing, rebuilding trust, and getting to know each other anew. Abby, leaving her luggage in the hallway, approached her aunt. "I brought my psychology essays. You promised to help with editing." After everything that had happened, the girl had transferred to the psychology department, trying to understand herself and, perhaps, to help other victims of manipulation someday. "Of course," Olivia smiled. "I've got your favorite room ready." In the evening, when Abby was asleep, the sisters sat on the terrace, looking out at the calm water. "Sometimes I wonder how things could have turned out differently," Grace said quietly. "If I had told you the truth about Thomas before." "You can't change the past," Olivia shrugged. "But the future is in our hands." She raised her glass. "To new beginnings, to honesty, to our family." Their glasses clinked together in the silence of the night. The wounds still ached, but slowly, day by day, they began to heal. They knew now that no matter what secrets lurked behind the family masks, only the truth and the support of loved ones could be a true support in the darkest of times.